Chapter 1, Birth of the Strongest, the Beginning of Solitude. The story of Satoru Gojo, a central figure in the universe of JujutsuKaisen, invites us to reflect on fundamental aspects of human existence: the burden of power, Gojo as a tool, the tragedy of isolation, and the conflict between duty and freedom. His life is not merely a succession of magical battles, it is a deeply philosophical ontological journey about being and duty, and about the impossibility of being fully human when one transcends too far beyond the limits of the common man. From birth, Gojo was marked by destiny. Bearer of the 6 eyes and the limitless technique, his abilities positioned him as a unique being. As Nietzsche would say in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, man is something that shall be overcome, but in Gojo, that overcoming was not gradual but abrupt. He was born already surpassing others, and that, far from bringing him fulfillment, condemned him to a life of misunderstanding and solitude. The figure of the Nietzschean Übermensch finds a tragic representation in Gojo. Not because he failed in his ideals, but because he did not find a world that understood him or offered him space to express his humanity. In Nietzsche's words, he who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. From childhood, Gojo gazed into the abyss of his own power and, consequently, was devoured by it. At an early age, he already showed signs of arrogance and disdain for social rules, which is understandable considering that, to him, the world was full of people incapable of reaching him in strength or thought. His contempt for authority and his rebellion against the structure of the jujutsu world are symptoms of a mind that has ceased to recognize itself in its peers. How can one expect humanity from someone who does not know weakness? But even at that pinnacle of power, Gojo felt a basic human need: connection. His friendship with Suguru Geto was his first attempt to find meaning not only in his existence as a sorcerer but in his life as a human being. Camaraderie, sharing missions, thoughts, and dreams with someone who seemed to understand him, was a hope amid desolation. However, despite that friendship, the arrogance that Gojo maintained in his adolescence did not disappear. Thus, in his first encounter with Toji Fushiguro, he was defeated. This defeat, a product of his arrogance, implied not only the failure to protect his friend Suguru Geto, who was also defeated by Toji, but it meant much more. In the face of defeat, he forged a profound and tragic thought. That battle marked the beginning of the rupture of that friendship and the onset of a new tragedy. Chapter 2, The Moral Dilemma and the Murder of a Friend, the Echo of Antigone. One of the most heartbreaking moments in Gojo's life is his confrontation with Suguru Geto, his best friend and later enemy, whom he ends up killing in the events of JujutsuKaisen 0. This episode condenses many of the classic moral dilemmas addressed in philosophy: duty versus compassion, justice versus loyalty, and destiny versus choice. Suguru Geto, upon abandoning the ideals of the jujutsu school and becoming an extremist, symbolizes the failure of a society that did not know how to integrate or protect its best elements. His radical vision, to eliminate non-sorcerers to create a pure jujutsu world, represents a form of active nihilism, in the Nietzschean sense. For him, the world had to be transformed even through violence because the current structures were unsustainable. Gojo, on the other hand, opts for a tragically conservative path. Despite understanding Geto's motives, he cannot let him continue on his path. Here, the tension between two currents of moral thought is revealed: utilitarianism and deontology. While Geto seeks the well-being of the few at the expense of the many, Gojo chooses to maintain the established order, even if it means killing his best friend. This act recalls the Greek tragedy Antigone, where duty to the law conflicts with duty to affections. Gojo, like Creon, chooses the law, but unlike him, he does so with tears and pain. The murder of Geto is not a victory but an irreversible loss that will forever mark Gojo's psyche. In existentialist terms, this moment defines the radical freedom that Sartre attributes to the human being. Gojo chooses, despite everything, even against himself. But that freedom, so celebrated by existentialism, is also a condemnation. We are condemned to be free, said Sartre. Gojo knows it. Killing Geto was a choice that only he could make, and for which he would also bear the burden for the rest of his life. Chapter 3, Master of the Condemned, Hope as an Ethical Act. After Geto's death, Satoru Gojo does not disappear into pain nor sink into absolute nihilism. He chooses, once again, to act. This time, he decides to dedicate himself to teaching. Based on the belief that the sorcerer system was rotten from its roots, he tries to regenerate it from within. His role as a teacher represents a significant change. He no longer acts as a warrior but as a mentor. Here we can see in Gojo a figure akin to Stoicism. Epictetus held that, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Instead of being dragged down by guilt or despair, Gojo assumes pain as an inevitable part of life. He does not seek to avoid suffering but to transform it into motivation for a better future. By taking under his tutelage young people like Yuji Itadori, Megumi Fushiguro, and Nobara Kujisaki, Gojo tries to plant seeds that he himself could not cultivate in his youth. But beyond teaching them combat techniques, what he tries to instill in them is an attitude towards life, the freedom to choose for oneself, the ethical responsibility of the powerful, and the importance of human connection in a world that pushes towards isolation. Marcus Aurelius said in his Meditations, "The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane." Gojo sees madness in the Sorcerer's Council, in its policy of extermination, in the manipulation of young lives like Yuji's. But he does not fight with bureaucratic weapons, but with example. However, his way of teaching is not without criticism. He often acts lightly, with misplaced humor or disdain for rules. This makes him seem irresponsible, but in reality, he is adopting the role of the Socratic teacher. Socrates did not teach from authority but from irony, forcing his disciples to think for themselves. Gojo, by pushing his students out of their comfort zone, by making them face impossible decisions, prepares them for a cruel but real world. Simone Weil wrote that, "Education is the attention directed toward the real." In this sense, Gojo is a radical educator. He does not indoctrinate but prepares for chaos. Because he knows chaos from within. Because he has seen his friends die, has killed with his own hands, and has felt absolute impotence in the face of an unjust system. Nevertheless, this hope placed in the new generation is also a form of redemption. Gojo wants to break the circle. If he could not save Geto, perhaps he can save Itadori. If he could not protect Riko Amanai, perhaps he can protect Megumi. This transfer of meaning turns his role as a teacher into a fundamental ethical act. Chapter 4, The Duel with the King of Curses, Pride, Fall, and Death of an Ideal. The hero's fate is not victory, but the fall that teaches. 4.1 The Inevitable Clash, Gojo vs Sukuna. The battle between Gojo Satoru and Ryomen Sukuna was not merely a confrontation between two supernatural forces. It was the collision of two absolute ideas of power. Sukuna, the king of curses, embodied chaos, destruction, and indifference to life. Gojo, the self-proclaimed strongest, was a symbol of hope and control in a world where chaos kept advancing. They represented irreconcilable extremes. One was the will to live without moral constraints, the other, a desperate attempt to bring structure to a world unwilling to be redeemed. But the most significant aspect wasn't the destruction they caused, it was the internal tragedy that led Gojo to confront Sukuna in that way. Like the great tragic heroes of Greek thought, such as Achilles or Oedipus, Gojo believed he could control fate. His power, unique and unmatched, had isolated him from everyone, while simultaneously making him the point of reference. This isolation made him dangerous, for he believed that if he couldn't save the world, then no one could. 4.2 Pride as a moral trap, hybris in modern times. Hybris, the excessive pride that doomed tragic heroes in ancient Greece, was also Gojo's sin. His certainty that he could defeat Sukuna was based not only on his technical skill but also on the idea that his very existence represented humanity's final line of defense. His fatal mistake was thinking the fight was between equals, when in reality it was a game orchestrated by someone who knew and had lived more, Sukuna, using Megumi Fushiguro's body as a vessel. His defeat didn't result from a single mistake but from an incomplete vision of the world and the enemy. Gojo underestimated the nature of evil, believing that pure power would be enough to overcome it. In this, he diverged from the true sages, like Socrates, who understood that power without knowledge and self-restraint becomes the instrument of downfall. Gojo's death is not simple, it reveals a moral and philosophical flaw. He who had taken on the responsibility of protecting the world ended up a martyr to his own arrogance. 4.3 The price of being the strongest, Kierkegaard and despair. Through the lens of Soren Kierkegaard's existentialism, we could say Gojo lived in what the Danish philosopher called the despair of the absolute self. That is, the anguish of one who believes they must carry all of reality on their shoulders, who must be the savior, but is ultimately terribly alone. Gojo couldn't delegate, didn't trust the world or others. He was trapped in his own image. This state of despair is especially tragic because it doesn't manifest as obvious suffering. Gojo was charismatic, strong, sarcastic. But as Kierkegaard described, the deepest despair is the one that doesn't recognize itself as such. Only in the moment of his death, when he accepts that others might be able to finish what he started, do we glimpse redemption. 4.4 Nietzsche and the twilight of the idol. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the twilight of the idols, of how absolute values must die to give rise to the self-overcoming human. Gojo was an idol, to his students, his enemies, to the Jujutsu society. His death represents the collapse of the unshakable ideal, the fall of the hero who could do everything. Yet this twilight is not the end, it is the beginning of something else. In dying, Gojo makes room for others to step into the space he once monopolized. Like all Nietzschean idols, his fall is necessary for new values to emerge. 4.5 A death without glory, meaning in the absurd. Albert Camus would have found in Gojo's death an example of heroic absurdity. There is no glory, no applause, no reward. Just a clean, dry separation, a life cut short by a superior evil. And yet, Camus taught that even in defeat, there is dignity. Gojo dies without asking for forgiveness, without pleading for compassion. He accepts death as the consequence of his path. And in doing so, he reclaims his freedom, his absurd but necessary struggle for a world that wasn't even ready to be saved. 4.6 The wound of the absent master, grief, void, and continuity. Gojo's death was not just the fall of an individual, but the collapse of a structural figure. He wasn't only the strongest, he was the cornerstone of the jujutsu system, the final guarantor of balance. His disappearance created a vacuum that affected not just his allies' morale, but the very structure of the fight against evil. For his students, Yuji, Megumi, Nobara, Yuta, Maki, Inumaki, Panda, and many others, Gojo was more than a teacher. He was the only adult who truly believed in their potential, in a broken system where youth was cannon fodder. Gojo broke the rules to protect them, to empower them, to teach them not just techniques but dignity, discernment, and the freedom to question tradition. Gojo's loss is an emotional fracture. But it is also an ontological opportunity, in the sense Martin Heidegger described regarding being toward death. In his absence, the students can no longer delegate responsibility to their master. They must take the world as it is. The grief, if properly channeled, becomes a source of authenticity. Yuta weeps in silence. Maki grows even harder. Megumi is trapped in a tragic fate. Yuji, like Prometheus, bears a guilt that is not his own, but chooses to go on. Each of them grieves in their own way. Yet through that grief, Gojo's teachings endure as a moral compass. 4.7 The transcendence of Gojo, dying so others may live. In a scene before his death, Gojo speaks with Geto in the spiritual plane. He says he was finally able to fight at his full potential, and that he is at peace. Within that statement lies an implicit notion of transcendence. Gojo accepts that his death has meaning if it clears the way for the next generation. He is no longer the savior, but a link in a chain. From Viktor Frankl's perspective, we might say Gojo found meaning in his suffering. His life is not defined by victory or defeat, but by what he sowed. His existence was not in vain, for it ignited the fire in others. From Roman Stoicism, as in the thought of Marcus Aurelius, we take the idea that one should live and die not for glory, but in harmony with nature and duty. Gojo dies because he is part of the world's flow, a world that demands sacrifices, and he accepts it without bitterness. There is no despair, only awareness. His final expression shows no fear, only peace. He has transcended. 4.8 Gojo as a living symbol in those who remain. Paradoxically, Gojo is more alive in death than he ever was in life. Not in body, but in legacy. Each of his students carries a part of him. In Maki's decision to face the Zenin clan and rewrite her story. In Yuji's courage to accept his role as Sukuna's vessel. In Yuta's moral evolution as a protector of the innocent. Even in Megumi, trapped by Sukuna, the seed of Gojo remains, the struggle to be free from lineage and fate. This kind of posthumous life echoes Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote that, "The meaning of life is built in the eyes of the other and in the continuity of the human project." Gojo, then, lives on in the gaze of those who understood him, in those who continue his mission. 4.9 A universal teaching, transcendence through action and freedom. From the existentialist philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, especially in Being and Nothingness, human beings are not defined by a prior essence, but by their actions and free choices. Gojo's life exemplifies this constant struggle to transcend oneself through action. For Sartre, man is condemned to be free, that is, he is thrown into the world without inherent meaning and must construct it through his projects. Gojo, far from accepting a fixed identity or destiny imposed by his power, continually chooses who he wants to be in an adverse world. His transcendence lies not in mere power or fame, but in how he projected himself as a teacher and mentor, building meaning through his deeds. In teaching and preparing the next generation, Gojo didn't just pass down technique, he offered the possibility of authentic freedom, the freedom to assume responsibility, to choose one's values, and to forge a path amidst chaos. In this sense, Gojo embodies Sartre's notion of being for itself, a being defined by conscious choice and rebellion against the constraints of the world. His legacy, then, is not just inherited power, but the imprint of a life that refused to be determined, and that, through freedom and action, created meaning. Gojo dies, but his being continues in those who, inspired by his example, choose to keep fighting and build new projects of self. In the freedom and responsibility of those acts lies true human transcendence.